Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the country Sudan. It is a country in Africa where our book A Long Walk to Water takes place. The Sudan is actually a war-torn country. They have been at war for almost the last 60 years, and these wars have it's a few different wars, but they just have very short breaks in between. The UN has actually ranked them as one of the least peaceful nations in the world because of this. So, A Long Walk to Water follows a boy who's living through one of the civil wars. So, there's the first Civil War and then the second Civil War in the 1980s, which is when the main character of this book is living. It also tells the story of a girl living in South Sudan in 2008. And it flips back between the two stories to kind of show the development of Sudan and the connection between the past and the more recent past. It is a pretty complicated history of a country. So today we're going to talk about Sudan a little bit more to help us understand the book better. So first off, I wanted to show you guys a map of Africa in the 1980s versus this year. Specifically, let's take a look at Sudan. So you'll see here's Sudan in the 1980s. It's pretty big back then. And you can see it has borders with Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia. So it reaches all the way down there. One of the results of the civil wars that I was talking about are that Sudan actually formed two separate countries and split into Sudan and South Sudan. So South Sudan in 2020 is now its own country. We'll talk about the reasons for that in just a second. But now you can see that Sudan itself no longer borders Uganda and Kenya, but instead South Sudan has those borders now. So from 1899 to 1955, Sudan was actually ruled by two different countries. They didn't have their independence yet. They were ruled by Egypt in the south. So what would become South Sudan was ruled by Egypt, and they were ruled by the English in the north. So the English actually encouraged the Muslim faith to develop. So the Muslim faith is called Islam. And they would build mosques, they built roads for people to take pilgrimages and go to holy sites, and they really let that faith spread and were trying to let people have more freedom in their religion. Whereas the Egyptians in the southern half prevented the spread of Islam and they instead wanted Christianity to develop. They would send out missionaries, and the missionaries were the ones who were responsible for schools. So it made the people in the north, they had better schools because they were being taught by actual teachers, whereas the people in the South were just being taught by missionaries, so they weren't getting as good of an education. So it made the two halves of the country feel like two different countries, actually. And the there started to be tension between the two different halves. And the English weren't really helping Sudan grow economically or participate in the modern world. And the unrest got so great that in 1955, the English gave Sudan its independence and said that they could rule themselves. So that brings us to 1955 to 1972. Sudan is ruling themselves, but the people of Sudan felt like the government was not doing a good job. So the people rose up against the government. However, in the South, the people were really afraid that the more developed North would take their part of the country, or they wouldn't let them have equal representation in the government. So a war actually broke out right after they got their independence. It was just months after. This first civil war ended in 1972, and the southern part of Sudan is still a part of Sudan at the end of this, but they were given more independence to govern themselves. That brings us to the Second Civil War. This is when a long walk to water is taking place. So notice this is about 10 years later. Now, this doesn't mean that the fighting totally stopped and that people were just happy and peaceful in this time. People were still upset at the government. People weren't really happy with the way they were being treated. So, in that 10-year time frame, tensions were just starting to rise, and rebel groups like the Sudan People's Liberation Army started to form. And these were groups that were not official organizations. They were what you would call guerrilla organizations, where they would use quick striking tactics to get back at the government. And often that meant a lot of collateral damage with their own people. So the government had actually started to violate some terms of the peace treaty that ended the first civil war. And so the Sudan People's Liberation Army fought back against the government. And the rebels and the government did finally come to an agreement. And they said, okay, South Sudan, you can become your own country, but not for 6 years. So that was in 2005. So in 2011 was when South Sudan was officially named a country. However, this war was really devastating on the people of Sudan. The rebels and the government um, caused a lot of casualties and fatalities of innocent people, and a lot of people lost their homes and had to flee for their lives. So there were thousands and thousands of refugees, and it also caused a famine that affected 3 million people, and many people died from that. And a lot of people died either from being killed by rebels or from the famine or from being refugees and having to try and get to another country to find safety, which we'll see a little bit more of that in A Long Walk to Water because Salva is one of the ones living during this war. So you can see in 2011 is when South Sudan became its own country. So in the book, Salva, the main character, is forced to flee from his home, and he walks all the way from Sudan to Ethiopia, and he has to cross the Nile River. So we don't know exactly where he fled from, but we know he has to cross the Nile, so it's probably somewhere up here. So he crosses into Ethiopia. So he walks from one country into a whole different one. Um, we also have Naya, who lives in Sudan in 2008, and she has to walk all day long just to get unclean water to survive. So, looking a little bit more at Salva, to get to Ethiopia, he has to cross the uh, crocodile filled Nile River in handmade reed boats. So, I found a picture of what these reed boats might look like. In the book, they have two people per boat, and the Nile is so wide that it takes them 2 days to cross it, and there are crocodiles in them. When I was looking up pictures of crocodiles, it says that Nile crocodiles are some of the biggest crocodiles in the world. So I don't know about you, but I would not want to be in a huge river like that in this tiny boat with these things coming after me. So, Salva, when he does make it to Ethiopia, he has to live in a refugee camp, which this is not the exact one that he stayed in, but it looks something like this. Note that at the back, there's a big fence back there. That wasn't necessarily to keep people like locked in, but it was a deterrent for people to leave because if you left, you were not allowed back in. So if you gave up your place in this refugee camp where you were, I mean, safer than wandering a desert, then you were not allowed to come back in. I mean, just imagine if this was your shelter. They look like literal plastic bags draped over sticks. So there was the dictator in Ethiopia was overthrown, and so the new leader decided to throw out everybody in the refugee camps. So they are driven back to Sudan. So they have to go back over the border and cross the Nile again. And then Salva has to walk all the way down here to Kenya. So I'm not entirely sure where he walked from, but he comes all the way down here to Kenya. So he's now walked three different countries because he went from Sudan to Ethiopia, back to Sudan to Kenya. So the refugee camps in Kenya, once again, these are not the exact ones that Salva would have stayed in, but you can see that these are just plastic tents. They wouldn't offer very much protection from heat. There's no air conditioning in these. Or animals. You can imagine that there would probably be snakes or other desert creatures that could get to you in those. Now coming to Naya's story, because I don't want to say too much more about Salva. Naya spends all day, every day. She literally walks to a pond, gets water, walks back to her house, drops off the water, walks back to the pond, gets water, and walks back to her house. And that literally takes her all day long. So she does that every single day. It's her entire life. And the water that she goes to get isn't even clean water. So you can imagine the water that we get from like drinking fountains. If I wanted to go get water right now, I could be there in 30 seconds. So for Naya, it's her entire day. She doesn't get to go to school. She doesn't get to hang out with friends. Oftentimes there's thorns. She walks down there barefoot, and so she can get hurt walking down there, all for a little bit of unclean water. She can only take back as much as she can carry. So this is addressed a little bit in the book. There are lots of really bad things that can happen when you drink unclean water. So you can just get problems with your stomach, diarrhea, nausea, stomach cramps, aches and pains. You can actually get dehydration even though you're drinking that water. And you can also die from drinking unclean water. I mean, if you look at some of these pictures, I would not want to drink that water, but this is the only option that they have in some places in Africa. 3.575 million people die every year from drinking unclean water. So we'll see a little bit more of this in the book, but I just wanted you guys to be thinking about that going into A Long Walk to Water, that this is a real problem in the world and that people are still experiencing it right now. So that is it for the history of Sudan. I hope that you guys understand the book a little bit better now.